So the Archbishop of Canterbury has been Archbishop for about 5 years. And quite soon after he took up the post, I, through various contacts and things, had breakfast with him in his study in Lambeth Palace. And, you know, I've been, as I'm going to say, I've been engaged in LGBT activism for quite a long time, 30 years in fact. And, you know, I thought it was important that we had a conversation early on in his archiepiscopacy, so that we could kind of see how the land lay. So I turned up at Lambeth Palace and went and sat in his study. He was a bit late, but he came down bearing a saucepan full of rather cold porridge, which we ate sitting around the table. And I have to say, I was really quite disappointed by the breakfast, and I suspect he was as well, because he sort of arrived in a bad mood and left in a bad mood, despite the fact that I'd tried quite hard, to charm him, as you do. And basically his argument was, why can't you lot keep quiet? Look, stop making a fuss about all of this. He wanted to talk about poverty, rightly, because, that's obviously a huge issue. And he knew that Rowan Williams, his archiepiscopacy had been really, that was why Rowan Williams gave up in the end, because he just realised that he wasn't able to make any progress, and he was being so attacked by conservative Christians that he just got worn out and said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to be master of a Cambridge college because that's easier. So I'm being a bit unfair, but he did just get exhausted, and Justin didn't want that to happen. So he kind of was saying, please, can you just keep quiet? And I said, no, we can't keep quiet. I'm sorry, because we're here as Christians, we're here as Anglicans, and until the Church of England is able to recognise us as full members, we're not going to go away. So he said, well, we better go to prayers then, hadn't we? So, so we went to prayers. There is a happy ending to this story, which I'll come to in a few moments. So I'm a parish priest in central London, Waterloo. Some people think Waterloo is South London, but they're wrong. It's central London. Previously, I was in Dulwich and then in Walworth. Before I was ordained, I worked in housing. And before that, I spent some time working with John Lewis, getting a management training. Before that, I was at Cambridge, and before that, I was at boarding school. So I've kind of followed the traditional middle-class English way. I've been agnostic, I've been Christian, I've been atheist, I've been Christian again, I've been agnostic Christian, I've been atheist agnostic, I've been Christian agnostic, and now I think I'm Christian solidly, but occasionally I have agnostic leanings. But throughout that period, I have also been gay. Actually, no, that's not true. Originally, I was queer because the word gay wasn't around when I was 11, so I knew that I was queer in an exclusively derogatory sense. And as Schulemat says, every human life is made up of many elements and many strands. And I think perhaps the most major strand in mine has been the attempt to integrate my spirituality with my sexuality. That sounds a bit cold. What I mean is that I've been trying to integrate my desire to love God with my desire to love and be loved by other people, particularly love as expressed sexually, which in my case means with people of my own gender. It's been a complicated journey. It hasn't always been very happy. I've been into the wilderness and I've been out again. I've tried to suppress my faith and I've tried to suppress my sexuality, but both have a habit of popping up again. And in the end, the only option is to try to make sense of both as two parts of the complex mosaic, which is the human person. And the trouble is that Christianity has been institutionally homophobic since perhaps Augustine in the 4th century AD, certainly during the Middle Ages, and very much so once the Reformation kicked in and family and patriarchy took over from the church as the model unit of society. Luther was looking for an alternative to the church, and he hit upon the family. His model of the family was very much with the patriarch and the woman serving the patriarch, and the children being little potential patriarchs or little potential women serving patriarchs. And that's become so much the model in Western society. Now, some people have said to me, well, you knew that when you went into the Church of England. And yes, I did, of course I did. I wasn't stupid. And in fact, when I was a teenager, I became involved in something approaching fundamentalism. It was through a church which you may have heard of called Holy Trinity Brompton, which now runs the Alpha course. And I was converted to that strand of Christianity. I gave my life to Jesus. I did all the things you're supposed to do. And it took about a year for me to realise, age 15 or 16, that there was no place for me within that part of Christianity, no place for people who loved people of their own gender. So I left it behind, and I went off to Cambridge to study theology as an atheist, but I couldn't let go of God. So when, during my 20s, I went slightly shamefacedly back to church and didn't really tell anyone because it was embarrassing, I understood that this new relationship that I was forming with God wouldn't work unless I could, like Shulamit, be absolutely myself, both with God and with the church. So that's a kind of long introduction to the topic, which is changing the church's attitude on LGBTI plus Christians. Because I took the decision right at the start of my return to the church in my 20s that I had to be openly myself with every time there was an encounter with the institution. And so what's happened is that I've gradually found myself moving more and more to the centre of the church, but in the strange role of being an outsider, so as well. So I'm kind of both an outsider and I'm right at the heart of the institution. And I think in a way that's been one of the factors, not just me, but several of us who've helped the church to move by going into the middle and just being there. So there are three elements of really what I've been doing over the past 30 years. The first is activism, the second is dialogue, and the third is the establishment. So in terms of activism, I found myself, as I say, very early on, back in the 80s, becoming an LGBTI plus activist. Only in those days it was called a gay activist. I set up something called the Lesbian and Gay Support Network, which had secret meetings in South London. Then it was the time when Rowan Williams was being very attacked by conservative Christians, and it was all very difficult, and we were seen as very unpopular. We were a problem. We caused problems. We had unacceptable demands. We put out statements. We used to demonstrate outside Church House during the General Synod, and it was all very awkward indeed. Does that say 5 minutes?
Yeah, but I'm not showing it.
Oh, okay, good. Phew. It was all very awkward indeed, really, and I was generally unpopular. I was supported by the people within the diocese, and I had a good, solid job as a parish priest, but people just saw me, and a number of us, as a problem. I set up something called Inclusive Church, which was a really important initiative because it brought together the different aspects of exclusion. So it tried to engage with gender, with ethnicity, with poverty, with disability. And our argument was very strongly that, if you're going to have justice, then you have to have justice in every area. But again, people got confused and they said, well, what are you? Are you supporting gay people or what are you doing? And we said, we're trying to help the church to move forward. But we kept getting pushback all the time, got pushback all the time. But the other thing that we did was form coalitions with other lesbian and LGBTI plus organisations. Because, as I'm sure you all know, the nature of this is that you tend to end up with lots of quite small organisations, and they argue with each other and they fall out with each other. And within the Church of England, there were two particularly. There was one called Changing Attitude, and there was one called LGCM. And the two people, the person at the head of each of those organisations really couldn't stand their counterpart, so they never spoke to each other. So we tried to bring them all together. And to some extent, we did that. So we all managed to be in the same room. And gradually something began to emerge, which was a bit more coherent and perhaps a bit less angry. I was talking during the break to someone about the kind of level of anger which was around. And it's kind of like there had to be that sort of anger around, because if there wasn't, you would just give up, really. But it was like bashing at the door and saying, let us in, let us in. And sometimes you really do have to bash at the door in order for it to, it's even slightly open. And then once it's a bit open, you can perhaps push it a bit more gently. So that led on to the next part of what I was trying to achieve, which was dialogue, really. To begin with, it was impossible to dialogue with the people who disagreed with you, partly because they simply didn't want to be in the same room as you. And then gradually, it began to become possible to talk to organisations like Anglican Mainstream, which was a very, very conservative organisation. They never wanted anyone to know that it was happening. It was a bit like the Northern Irish peace talks all those years ago when the IRA was talking to the government. We used to literally meet in secret and be sworn not to tell anyone that we were engaging. And in some ways, the dialogues weren't entirely helpful, because we ended up, we were still as far apart at the end as we were at the beginning, at the time. But what it did begin to do was to enable relationships to build between people. And even though some of those relationships, didn't turn into anything, there were others which began to become something like a friendship with people who were definitely on the other side of the inclusion divide from us. So that dialogue, although at times I would despair because did really feel like bashing my head against a brick wall, it began to be more and more helpful. And certainly some of the relationships which have been formed are beginning to pay off now, 10 or 15 years later. And here we are, and here I am, as I say, perhaps at the end of this part of my engagement, because I very much want to move on from LGBTI stuff, because I've been talking about it for 30 years and I'm getting quite bored of it. But I can't give up at the moment because I'm very much part of the establishment now. I'm on the General Synod, which is the Church's parliament. I'm chair of the General Synod Human Sexuality Group. The bishops have now decided to produce a document which they hope is going to be helpful. It's going to be a teaching document on marriage and same-sex relationships. And there's a coordinating group which is meant to be producing that document, and I'm on that coordinating group, so I'm advising the people who are putting the document together. And that document came about because at the General Synod last February, feels a lot longer ago, but at the General Synod last February, the bishops offered a previous document, which was called Marriage and Same-Sex Relationships, which basically said there could be no change. And I and a few colleagues on Synod were instrumental in getting that document thrown out. And we got it thrown out because there were enough people in the middle ground who heard what we were saying and who trusted what we were saying. And to everyone's shock and amazement, particularly kind of open evangelicals, people somewhere in the middle who wouldn't naturally see themselves as allies of LGBTI, felt that they understood what we were saying, and they voted with us. And so by about 4 or 5 votes, we got this document thrown out. And as a result of the document being thrown out, the Archbishop said, and this is the kind of happy ending to the story, the Archbishop said, "How we deal with the real and profound disagreement put so passionately and so clearly by many at the Church of England's General Synod debate on marriage and same-sex relationships today is the challenge that we face as people who all belong to Christ. To deal with that disagreement, to find ways forward, we need a radical new Christian inclusion in the Church. This must be founded in Scripture, in reason, in tradition, in theology. It must be based on good, healthy, flourishing relationships and in a proper 21st century understanding of being human and being sexual." And if you think that 5 years previously, he'd had a grumpy breakfast with me when he said, "Why can't you lot just shut up?" It is a really extraordinary move. Now, I'm not saying that, we're there yet. There's still a huge amount of distance. We've still got the triple lock that Shulamite mentioned. Marriage is not acceptable within the Church we live, but we have made enormous progress. And I think we made enormous progress because we've tried to both push but also engage. And I suppose if I was offering you anything, I'd say that that's the most important thing. You don't have the same kind of rigid hierarchical structure that we have within the Church of England. But I think the fact that this is happening at this conference is a kind of indicative way of the way in which people are trying to engage. And I'd say do that more. But ultimately, and the most important thing, I think, is to be yourselves, and for us all to be ourselves. 1 minute left, and I can't fill the minute because I've got nothing left to say.